Hello, everyone. This is Lupe Garcia. Welcome back to WP Talks Major Fundcast. I'm a partner with Whitley Penn, and also here today is Selena Seticetis. Selena, say hello to everybody.
Hi, everyone. We're glad to be back for our second episode with a special guest, Sarah Langlois, a partner at KBS, and she can tell us more about her firm and a little bit of background about herself.
Hi guys, thank you so much for having me here today, my dear friends Selena and Lupe. It's amazing to be your second guest on the podcast. It is an honor, especially dealing with the limited interaction that I've had with people face-to-face the last few weeks, as I'm sure you all have had. As Selena said, I am a partner here in the Houston office of KBS Law Group. We have offices in Houston, Austin, Nacogdoches, and Beaumont. We primarily represent school districts, including ISDs, charter schools, and junior colleges. I also do some nonprofit work as well. I like to say I do everything but special ed because there are, no pun intended, special ed is a specialized area. And so I do procurement, a lot of HR, employment law work, construction work as well. And I'm excited to be here with you guys today.
Well, I have to correct you. This is our second episode, but you're our very first guest. So,
yay! Yes. Even better.
So what have the last 6 to 8 weeks looked like for you? I know you have two little ones at home, so how have you been juggling that and serving your clients?
No, it's been I'm sure everybody across the Houston area and across the nation and the world, it's been a struggle, to adequately serve my clients and simultaneously try to homeschool, as you said, two little ones. I have a first grader, Ella, and a pre-K 4, Sam, who you can imagine, his attention span is like a gnat. And so his Zoom meetings are quite interesting every morning. But it's been rough for everybody. I am very blessed, though, that, we are all safe and we are healthy and we are managing day to day, just like everybody else, and trying to help clients navigate, this truly unprecedented time in the world.
Right. So Selena and I covered some of the questions we've been getting over the last 6 to 8 weeks throughout this coronavirus pandemic stay-at-home order. I'm sure you've received a lot of questions over the last 6 to 8 weeks. What are some of those questions you've been getting from your clients?
Lots and lots of questions, and they've really run the gamut. In the beginning, when everybody thought, oh, this is just going to be an extended spring break, it was more of how do we get that message out to students and really, trying not to panic and trying to truly assess the situation. I mean, the issue, though, for everybody, is that situation was changing literally day by day, hour by hour. And so the superintendent's calls that were occurring, initially, like I said, did anticipate, more of an extended spring break. And then it became apparent that it was going to be more than that. It was going to be perhaps for a couple of weeks or a month. And then, of course, now we know it's, for the rest of this school year, if not beyond that. And so, the initial calls that were coming in and issues we were dealing with were things like emergency board meetings. And how do we get the boards to delegate authority for purchasing under the emergency exception to procurement? What about premium pay? What about remote learning? How are we going to continue to deliver instruction to kids? And what does that look like? And that differs a lot client by client, depending on the size of the particular district at issue. What are their resources? What does their student population look like? I mean, if it's in a district that is 98% economically disadvantaged, well, those kids aren't likely going to have access to things like an iPad or their own device or internet at home. And so how do we procure that? What about providing food? Or can we provide food through Texas Department of Agriculture? Can we use child nutrition funds for that? How are we going to get it to them? What kind of screening for the people who are packing the boxes? What can we ask them? What can we take their temperature legally? All of those kinds of things. And then, and now we're moving into what about graduation? The TEA and the governor just released guidance concerning graduations, and so we're getting a lot of questions about how do we perform graduation? What about prom? Do we postpone prom? Can we get our money back from the venue for prom? And then there's a ton of employee issues, lots and lots of concerns, genuine concerns about people's well-being, but also, not wanting to trample on people's rights as well. Can we take their temperature? Can we ask them questions? Can we ask them questions about their family members? What about people who don't want to come back to work? Can we make them come back to work, or can we dock their pay if they don't? So it's really a lot of genuine questions that is all new areas of the law. I mean, the CARES Act and the expanded FMLA, we're very busy trying to keep up to speed with the new provisions as they roll out.
Let's unpack some of that. That was a lot, Sarah.
You asked what I've been dealing with. That's what I've been dealing with. And first grade math, which, by the way, they don't teach math the way that I learned math.
Right, Common Core. Why is having emergency procurement resolutions in place important? What does that allow governmental entities to do?
So that's a great question. For a couple of reasons. One, under 44031 of the Texas Education Code, there is a provision that allows a Board of Trustees to basically waive the procurement requirements required by law, and say during the period of an emergency, you can go ahead and make emergency-related purchases without the necessity of fulfilling those competitive procurement requirements. Under FEMA rules, though, I will say in the federal rules, the definition of emergency is much stricter. It's more narrow than our state definition. And we have seen that before, with Harvey and with Ike and other disasters that, for example, FEMA's definition of the emergency and length of the emergency in particular was quite short. But in this situation, I joke that the people, especially the media, often overuse the word unprecedented, but I really do think in this circumstance, it's an extremely applicable word. And so we don't know. I mean, that the disaster declaration is not over. And so arguably, districts can still be making emergency purchases without going through the competitive procurement requirements. My advice, though, to districts is that if you can find a good or a service on a validly procured contract, whether that's a contract that you yourself went out and procured or one that's through a legitimate, verifiable cooperative, go ahead and make that purchase through that mechanism because it satisfies the competitive procurement requirements. And so the declaration, though, is still important for legal purposes. TASB put out a sample resolution for districts. We had one that we crafted as well that didn't just cover the emergency procurement exception, but also delegated a lot of authority to the superintendent to make these day-to-day decisions, like making emergency purchases for remote learning, for example, or for sanitizing schools. So that's why it's important.
So, Sarah, but is the reason they say, or you're saying, go through a cooperative or use a vendor that you've already competitively procured if you can, because if, I guess, FEMA or any other regulatory agency, they can challenge you and say, well, you could have had time to competitively
right.
Is that the
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And so the whole point of the emergency procurement exception is that under the circumstances, you don't have time to go out and do a competitive procurement because of the emergency. But if you already have them under contract, then you can show, well, I did the competitive procurement. They're already been procured. Or if they're under a cooperative contract. I will say, at least for FEMA purposes, that, to generalize, FEMA is not a giant fan of co-ops. They actually have a document that you can find on the internet that talks about, that's a FEMA guidance about cooperative purchases. And they say you really need to document why you're using that particular purchase, and says, an applicant that decides to use a cooperative purchasing program must document and explain how its use of the program complied with all federal procurement standards and applicable state, tribal, and local procurement rules and policies. And I typically like to say not all co-ops are created equally. There are some really good ones that do an excellent job about complying with applicable laws, including those promulgated by FEMA. and the other federal regulations, the 2 CFR 200, the uniform guidance. And then there are some that just aren't. They will issue an RFP, and then if you respond, voila, you are now under contract. The other thing I will say in terms of the use of cooperatives is if you're going to use a co-op contract, make sure that the good or the service that you are purchasing from that co-op was actually procured. Because a lot of times the vendor will say, oh, yeah, I'm a member of XYZ co-op. Well, that doesn't mean you're automatically can sell, or the district rather can buy from them anything and everything. What was the actual good or service being procured? And you need to verify that it was actually subject to a competitive procurement. I've also put together a FEMA addendum document, and I call it FEMA, but it's actually all the 2 CFR 200 guidelines plus the additional ones that FEMA tacks on that you should use if you are entering into a contract, whether that's a co-op contract or a contract you procured, or you're going under the true emergency exception. Still use that addendum because FEMA is going to want to check those boxes and make sure that you have those required contractual provisions.
Yeah, and today, Lupe and I received a question from one of our audit managers that asked about a specific vendor related to special education, and TEA was talking about their relationship and their partnership with this vendor. So a great question from our audit manager was, can this be an emergency purchase and circumvent the competitive procurement procedures, given that TEA is talking about this particular relationship? Our response was no. I mean, they've vetted the vendor as far as services they can provide, but they have not competitively procured the vendor for your use. So you still have to be very careful. There's other vendors that are under the same situation where TEA has vetted them as far as the services they can provide, but they have not competitively procured. So we have to be really careful with these type of press releases or
Absolutely.
announcements where regulatory agencies are partnering with vendors doesn't necessarily mean that you're free to buy from
Absolutely,
them.
yes. And we've seen this, not just in the COVID situation, but in other situations too, where same scenario, right? TEA has put them on a quote approved list, but then when we delve deeper, we find out that approved list is approved based on a certain set of, let's say, special ed regulation benchmarks, not competitive procurement. And so you're absolutely right. You'd still need to satisfy the competitive procurement obligations or truly justify it as an emergency purchase.
Yeah.
A lot of governmental agencies have decided to pay their non-exempt employees premium pay. Can they expect to be reimbursed from FEMA public assistance for this premium pay?
That's a great question, Lupe, and one that's been subject of much discussion, especially on, for example, the TASBO listserv, and TEA has put out some guidance about this as well. We know that in the past, FEMA regulations, and specifically about the public assistance program, has stated that they will only pay that premium pay or overtime pay if the district or the governmental entity had a premium pay policy in place before the disaster. And that's coming from page 23 of the most recent version of the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide. I will say, though, that on one of TEA's many FAQ documents, the one relating to FEMA, had a question of, would a district be eligible for FEMA reimbursement for premium or overtime expenses incurred post-policy adoption if the policy was adopted after the disaster was declared? So let's say, in this current situation, I think the disaster was declared, January 20th, I think is the first date. And so let's say the Board of Trustees didn't adopt a policy regarding premium disaster pay until its meeting in March. Or April even, or sometime after that. TEA's answer to that question was no, not under the current FEMA requirements. They did say, however, this requirement is potentially subject to change based on the severity and the geographic scope of the pandemic. As a result, TEA's guidance is that any district that wishes to provide premium pay to its employees should adopt the policy, if it has not done so already, as soon as possible. And that's how we've been advising clients. We had some who experienced this firsthand during Harvey. Attempted to seek FEMA reimbursement for premium pay incurred during the Harvey disaster from FEMA, and FEMA denied it, saying, based on this rule, nope, you didn't have a policy in place before the disaster, so we're not going to pay for it. And so that's how the law stands and the FEMA guidance is as today. But like TEA, many people are speculating that because this truly is a different disaster, that perhaps FEMA will not be as strict with some of its requirements. And this is one that, people are speculating could be one that they decide to waive under certain instances. And so I would recommend, go ahead and adopt it, but know, as of we sit here today, that is the FEMA rule, that you had to have that policy in place before the disaster in order to be reimbursed for that premium or overtime pay.
Okay. So I think the advice we've been given to our clients is continue to track your
Absolutely.
coronavirus-related expenditures separately. And
Absolutely.
funding may or may not be available to reimburse you at a later date, but at least
Yes.
you're tracking it separately.
Yes.
Sarah, what's the number one piece of advice you've been given to all your clients?
So in terms of procurement wise, it's absolutely to document, because there's this various levels of federal funding and potentially state funding as well that's going to be flowing, and we're going to have to prove that these purchases were reasonable, they were necessary, and that they were related to the pandemic. And so that's what TEA is recommending as well. In terms of documentation, TEA has said, at an absolute minimum, districts should be documenting the expenditures, of course, as you normally would, but you also need to specify the need for the expenditure, why federal funds are needed to address the issue, because we know, for example, with FEMA, they're not going to cover your normal, usual operating expenses. And so if it's going to be even an increase in those operational expenses, that's not going to be covered by the public assistance program under FEMA. Of course, you want to absolutely track and maybe, potentially have a budget code or a line code, commodity code for pandemic, COVID related purchases. So you're not reinventing the wheel, 6 months from now, a year from now, maybe even more than a year from now, when we're getting through that reimbursement process of having to go back and try to compile together the documentation. Absolutely keep that documentation. I'll use Derek Gillard at Pasadena ISD as an example, and I did ask for his permission. He just set up a great system, and it's simple, but it's great. I mean, it's a folder-based system, for every significant purchase, having a folder with each vendor's name and all of the documentation in there. If it's over the SAT of $250,000, that's where he has his independent estimates, cost and price analysis, the FEMA addendum that I was talking about earlier, the contract, the PO, all of those things are in that folder. The RFP or the co-op's RFP and contract, if it was a co-op purchase. And that way, whenever it becomes time to go through and submit all of those things to FEMA or to TEA for CARES Act funding, then you have it right there. You're not having to go back and reinvent the wheel, because that's much more difficult, as we all know, from a later basis. But, again, TEA is recommending tracking all of your COVID-19 costs, everything related from distance learning, cleaning and sanitizing needs, curriculum development, supplies that you need for distance learning, all of, and even personnel time relating to any of these types of things. Go ahead and track those, because especially with the CARES Act, it is very much to be seen of what is going to be eligible for funding. I mean, the categories under the CARES Act are incredibly broad, and we anticipate, basically anything COVID-19 related is going to be reimbursed. FEMA, on the other hand, is pretty narrow, especially, if you participated or in that call or the webinar that FEMA had with TDEM, I think it was last Friday before last. Here.
The first.
The days run together at this point. One of the big takeaways from that call was the statement that FEMA was not going to cover the distance learning purchases. And so, that FEMA is much more based on the true emergency purchases, more facility related, things like sanitizing and cleaning schools. But that the distance learning, if you're going to seek recovery for that, it's probably going to come through the CARES Act.
Sarah, what I think one of the things that we saw during Harvey was that when we review purchases, there was some doubt that the entity was already going to make a certain purchase.
Yeah.
So I always advise my clients that if this was already in the works prior to whatever emergency we're going through, it could be questioned. So go back through your minutes, make sure it wasn't something that the board was already planning to do, because FEMA can also read your minutes or any other regulatory agency and question that purchase. It's not enough just to put COVID-19 on the purchase order. You have to do your due diligence on what it is you're purchasing and why.
Yes, it's absolutely. It's much more than just coding it as COVID related. It actually has to be COVID related and be an expenditure, at least for FEMA, that's not already in your operational expenses. So if you were already planning on, for example, moving to a one-to-one program for, and this is probably going to be true for CARES Act too, although we have very little guidance so far as the CARES Act, but we can assume it'll be similar to other federal guidance, including FEMA. So let's say you were already had in the works that you were going to convert for a one-to-one program for student to either iPad or laptop, computer, some sort of device for all fifth graders. And you were going to do that in the spring of 2020. Well, then you went ahead and you bought laptops for all fifth graders or some sort of electronic devices, and you distributed those and you said, oh, no, we needed those because of the pandemic and we needed to distance learn. And so that's why we did it. Is it because you were already planning on doing that? And oh, look, here's some minutes of your board meeting where they approved the purchase of the one-to-one program. So that's an example of, you not just coding it as COVID related, but really going the extra step and saying, why is this necessary because of COVID?
Before we leave the topic of FEMA, I think we learned with Hurricane Harvey that FEMA and TDEM are doing a lot of the review and scrutinizing before you ever receive any reimbursement. So it's actually being audited on the front end versus after the payment's been made, similar to what we experienced with Hurricane Ike. So I think we can anticipate the same with anything coronavirus related. A lot of the review is going to happen before anyone sees any dollars.
Sure. And because, remember, FEMA's program assistance is a reimbursement program. And so, we've gone and spent the money, but it sometimes and oftentimes, unfortunately, does take quite some time to actually be reimbursed for those expenditures. I will say, too, that FEMA, and I think there was a lot of lessons learned after Harvey in particular and Ike as well. FEMA since then has put out some really good documentation. One of those is the contract provisions template. And it's very easy to read. It even gives you sample language. If you just Google FEMA contract provisions template, it will come up for you. And I have used this countless times over the last 6 weeks, pushing back on vendors who won't sign the provisions in the FEMA addendum to say, look, here's the document. It's required. Now, there are a portion that are just recommended, and it's hard for me to push back when a vendor says, well, I'm not signing the recommended ones. Well, okay. I'm not sure why, because they're pretty benign. They're things like using the DHS seal and logo, but whatever. As long as they're signing the required provisions, that's really what I care about. And the other document I want to mention is there's a public assistance applicant procurement compliance checklist, if that is not a mouthful. But it too is a chart that FEMA has put together where it's a yes and no. Like, are you a state? No. So you move to number 2. Does the procurement comply with your own state's rules? Do you have X provision? Do you have Y? Does it exceed $10,000? And so it's a very easy checklist to go through in order to see. And what I say is to maximize the possibility of FEMA reimbursement, because it's never guaranteed. So what we're trying to do is to document and make sure we're dotting the I's and crossing the T's as much as we can on the front end in order to maximize that reimbursement, which is likely to come a year, 2 years, perhaps even 3 years down the road.
So there's a lot of unknowns with the CARE Act. Have you experienced or have your clients experienced any challenges meeting any of the sections or the requirements of the CARES Act?
Yes. And so the CARES Act, there's guidance is to be forthcoming from the CARES Act, from the U.S. Department of Education, and then from TEA as well. We have not seen that true substantive guidance yet. We know that of the $30.75 billion for the Education Stabilization Fund, that $13.5 billion of that is going to be for elementary and secondary schools, and that 90% of that's going to be awarded directly to the LEA, to the local education agencies. And it's going to be based on a formula grant program to LEAs that will include charters who are classified as LEAs, based on a statutory formula. And the CARES Act, in terms of use of the funds, it's very broad, as I mentioned earlier. It's pretty much anything related that's going to be truly related to the pandemic. Any activity authorized under ESSA, for example, training and materials for sanitizing facilities, activities to address special populations like low income or English learners, providing one-on-one devices and internet connectivity is a specific one that's called out, so we know that that's going to be eligible. One of the things, though, that has really caught our eye in terms of advising clients, and I'm checking every day to see when guidance is going to come out on this, there's a specific section of the CARES Act that is called continued payment to employees, and says a local education agency, state, institution of higher ed, or other entity that receives funds under the Education Stabilization Fund shall, to the greatest extent practicable, continue to pay its employees and contractors during the period of any disruptions or closures related to the coronavirus. So most of the districts, in fact, all of the ones, knock on wood, that I represent, are still paying their employees, including, perhaps their janitors or their clerical staff who can't necessarily work remotely. They're still paying all of their employees. And so that doesn't give me pause. What gives me pause of this provision is the part about the continued payment to contractors, because a lot of questions that I have received over the past few weeks relate to, can we terminate our contract, for example, with our outside bus company? They're not transporting kids to school, so why are we continuing to pay them? And so, initially, prior to the CARES Act being passed, I said, absolutely, let's, review the contract, and if the contract terms and conditions allow you to terminate, let's terminate, because we're not getting the benefit of that service, so why are we paying for it? We're using taxpayer dollars. Then, with this provision, though, that's problematic. It does have the language to the greatest extent practicable. And so I, am cautioning individuals and clients about that this language is here. And I would say, let's document, as we talked about earlier, not only how these funds were spent and why they're related to the pandemic, but also we need to document, if we're terminating contractors, for example, why those service contracts were not valid, could not be renegotiated, in order to not jeopardize our receipt of these stimulus dollars.
The community colleges in Texas already have an idea of what their CARES Act allotment funding is going to be. School districts in Texas, however, do not. So that's proving to be a challenge from an external audit standpoint, because as we're planning and working through the 2020 federal single audit, it's an unknown as far as what that CARES Act funding will be.
We have CFDA numbers, but we don't know when the funding will be made available. And I know the Texas Association of School Business Officials has, in their Connect threads, they have said that it's probably unlikely that we'll have that funding available to us in 2020. We're hoping, because it would help many districts or other entities, but I'm not hopeful that it'll come. It might be better because it won't disrupt the 2020 audits. There's so many unknowns already with the 2020 audits, and so I'm hoping that that'll be pushed to 2021.
Right. So one area of a school district's operations that's continued is child nutrition. They've continued to make meals, deliver meals to students in their districts. So it gets a little tricky with having one federal grant reimburse another federal grant,
Right.
if that's even allowed, or it can happen. So I think a lot of child nutrition funds are going to be taking somewhat of a hit for this period of time.
Well, so we know for sure, right, that there's no double dipping when it comes to federal dollars. So if TDA or USDA, you're using child nutrition money for example, providing food for kids during this time, then don't apply for FEMA funding for that, because that's absolutely not going to be reimbursable if it's already being funded by federal funds. So make sure you're tracking those closely.
Yeah, one question I've seen is, and there's no answer to this, is will the loss of revenue be made up somewhat way, or the school district's going to be made whole for that loss of local revenue from their child nutrition departments? And
yeah, I've seen that question posed a lot. I haven't seen an answer.
The question is, I guess this would be more likely, is how much you got reimbursed from the Texas Department of Agriculture for the meals served. How much that reimbursement can cover your expenses. Would the excess for premium pay potentially be reimbursed through FEMA if the policy was already in place?
I would certainly try. Okay. I mean, especially if your policy was already in place. I mean, remember too, with FEMA's public assistance program, it's a 75-25. So FEMA's only going to reimburse you up to 75%, and then your cost share, your matching is going to be 25%. But I would absolutely, in that exact scenario, say try.
In an internal training recently, we had an icebreaker that was pretty popular and entertaining. We had everyone share a story from when they were a child that is still talked to this day in their families. So, Sarah, is there anything that comes to mind in your family that's still talked about that that you were a part of growing up?
There's a few. And thank goodness my parents aren't here, because they would have difficulty picking one. My favorite, though, and I guess it's childhood. I was a senior in high school, and so my mom, who was the equivalent of an assistant superintendent at the public school district that I went to, she taught there for 18 years and then was in administration for 18 years before retiring. This is her favorite story, so I'll tell this one, that I almost didn't graduate from high school, and I was valedictorian. My best friend on the planet was salutatorian. She made 1B in typing our first 6 weeks. That's what separated the two of us. God bless her. And so anyway, I almost didn't graduate because I had missed more than the maximum number of days of school. Not for being sick or anything, just because I was ditching. And so one day, it was probably, beginning of May, so really close to graduation, I'm sneaking out as I normally did. And so I'm running across the parking lot of the high school to my car, and I hear, "Sarah!" And I'm like, oh, crap, I finally got caught. And I turn around, and it's my mom. And she's there for business, she had a meeting or whatever. And she's like, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going to ride motorcycles with Dad." Because I had, my senior project was you had to submit something and learn to do something you've never done before. And once you submitted your topic, you couldn't retract it. So I, being the stubborn 18-year-old, 17-year-old, I guess, that at the time, submitted that I was going to learn how to ride a motorcycle. So I did, and then my dad bought me a Harley as my graduation present. So I was skipping out to go ride Harleys with Dad. And so I tell her that. I'm like, "I'm going to ride bikes with Dad." And she was like, "Well, let me just sign you out. You're going to get caught." And I said, "I can't miss any more days. I'm not going to graduate." So, of course, in my mother, in her true fashion, knowing as stubborn as I am and as hard-headed as my dad is as well, promptly just turned around, threw her hair back, and walked the other direction. And I graduated, obviously. But I was like, "You can't check me out," which was very cool of her that she was going to check me out to go ride Harley with Dad. But at the same time, you can't check me out. I'm literally not going to graduate.
Oh my gosh.
So they like to tell that story.
Do you still ride today?
I don't. I kept the bike halfway through law school, and it was really fun. And my husband, for the first Christmas we were together, I sent him to motorcycle riding school, because I'm like, "You're not gonna ride. I won't. Whatever you call it when you ride behind me." And so we rode. We had some great trips. My dad and I went up and did the Black Hills in South Dakota and Sturgis, and we did the Blue Ridge Parkway, and we have some great stories, but not anymore, now that I'm a mother and, have no fun anymore.
Selena, share something with us.
Okay.
Make it good.
I'm going to give you a visual. I was a chunky 8-year-old, and I'm wearing it's a light purple dress, but the bottom was a ruffly skirt, much darker to hide the chunkiness. And I love to dance, and it was It Takes Two by
I know the
Make a Thing
song.
Go Right.
It takes two.
Yes, that one was playing. But I had to go use the facilities, and I ran in, and I was wearing like some massively thick tights, right? As a little 8-year-old, they were white.
The pre-Spanx.
Yes, pre-Spanx. And I came out with a very long strip of toilet paper stuck in my pantyhose, and I'm cutting a rug. I'm still dancing.
Oh.
And then my aunt decides to do some oldie but goodie move and, swipes me in between her legs, underneath her. And then my 80-year-old uncle is dancing. He trips over me. He falls over me. It's all caught on VHS. So it was the toilet paper and then tripping everyone and my purple dress. It was super. It's still funny to this day, but yes, no one lets me live that down. So
you could sell the toilet paper.
I know. Boop it.
Your turn.
So my story actually just came up over this past Mother's Day weekend, and it's related to us not being able to go to hair salons and barbershops because everything's closed, right? So I was in the 5th grade, and my dad decided he was going to give it a go and give me a haircut, because that's about the age where you start caring about what you look like. And I was bugging that I wanted a haircut, and he was like, "Okay, we'll sit down and let's go for it." And we had clippers, and he had never used these clippers before. Needless to say, I went to school the next day with half a haircut. It looked terrible. I was made fun of on the school bus.
Yes.
I wasn't able to get it fixed till the following weekend, and so that story still comes up because I got half a haircut.
Half a haircut. I think there's a lot of people walking around now with half haircuts.
Exactly. Yeah, so I'm gonna wait it out. I'm not gonna let anyone try to give me a haircut that's never cut hair before.
Yeah.
So, Sarah, give us a little bit more about your background. I know you're from Louisiana, but how did you end up in Houston, Texas?
I am born and raised Cajun. I grew up in a really small town of Morgan City, Louisiana, 90 miles southwest of New Orleans. As I mentioned, my mom taught school, was an educator for 36 years. My aunts and uncles taught. My sister teaches, same school district that my mom taught in for all those years. And I joke it was all those Christmases and Thanksgivings of being surrounded with the educator acronyms that, instilled in me something education-wise. And so, but I went to college to study, and I did my undergraduate degrees in print journalism. Wanted to write for a newspaper, loved writing, analyzing, all of that. Worked for a paper my junior year and hated it. And then went, oh crap, now what? I mean, I'm, a year left of this degree. I can't change majors at this point. And so that next semester, I took the class everybody dreaded. It was the only class that the dean still taught, First Amendment law. And I loved it. Got the highest grade in the class. And my husband, my boyfriend at the time, we met working in a restaurant in Lafayette, Louisiana, at Copeland's. A lot of people know that restaurant. They still have one in New Orleans. Unfortunately, our homestead in Lafayette closed. But anyway, he said, you ever thought about going to law school? And I said, no, nobody in my family is a lawyer, literally not even an extended cousin or anything. And so I looked into it, and as they say, the rest is history, because I couldn't imagine doing anything else. And, also distinctly remember sitting in orientation at law school, and there was this panel of lawyers, all ages and different practices, and they all said, oh, you don't really pick your practice, it picks you. You just happen to, you graduate, you find a job, and then you practice whatever it is your partner in charge practices. And so it, it picks you. And I remember sitting there going, that's for the birds. I'm not doing that. And so I specifically looked for firms to clerk for who practiced school law. And so the first firm that I clerked for and that I worked for in my first few years of practice was McGinnis Lockridge. And I was super blessed to have an amazing mentor and honestly second dad, Jeff Davis, who was just a remarkable lawyer and an incredible person. And I couldn't have learned from a better guy. And my dear friend and now law partner, Ellen Spalding, worked for Jeff too, and we constantly, almost on a daily basis, say, what would Jeff do? Because we think about, his not just knowledge of the law, but he had this knack of always remembering and thinking and taking to his legal analysis, what's the practical impact of giving this legal advice? Like any monkey can, look up the statute and recite it to you. That's not what clients want. That's not what they need. They need you to be able to interpret that to their situation, which could be very different district to district. There's politics involved. There's different communities. And so I love what I do every day. I'm very blessed that I get to work with people I love and who support me. And I can't wait to come back to the office. I miss my people.
Well, hearing about your journalism background makes sense, because if anyone's heard you present or read anything, you've
That's so sweet of you.
Yeah, it's very well written and well thought out, so that makes a lot of sense.
I'm probably the only person, me and my 90-year-old neighbor, who still gets the physical newspaper that I read every morning with my cup of coffee. It's me. I'm me and my 90-year-old neighbor.
So we're going to do some fun fast facts with Sarah.
Oh, gosh.
So the first question for you, Sarah, is what was your first job?
My first real job, absent like babysitting and tutoring, right, was working at the restaurant where I met my husband.
Copeland's?
Yeah, Copeland's in Lafayette. So, right, first semester of college, I was a hostess and he was a barback. I only lasted like 2 months. I will say everybody should work at least some period of time in the service industry, because it does give you a very different perspective in life.
Have you ever seen the movie Waiting?
No.
Okay.
Should I?
It's a movie about the restaurant industry, a comedy, but I always, when I hear that someone else has worked in the restaurant industry, I ask them if they've seen that movie, if they agree with what they saw in the movie.
I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, you'll have to look it up.
Yeah.
There might be some truth, because if you were the hostess and your husband was the barback, ended up together. So
We've been bartending
20 years
from
ago.
high school through college. That's why.
Nice.
Right.
Nice. It's a
high school to college. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
Speaking of restaurants, what's your favorite restaurant when everything is back to normal?
Gosh.
If there's a new normal,
Yeah, right.
where would you like to go?
If there's a new normal, where would I like to go? A place that doesn't have a drive-through, where I don't have to do the dishes. No, I love, it's this tiny two. Can I say two? Because I can't pick one.
Yes.
Okay, so both remind me so much of New Orleans. In Louisiana. So one is Cafe Rabelais in the Village. It's been there forever. This tiny little French restaurant. Poor things, I bet their 25% capacity is like 2 tables, so they probably aren't even open at the moment. But Cafe Rabelais in the Village, and Copa. Oh no, not Copa. I do love Copa, but that's not it. Oh, Antica Asteria on Bissonnette. It's an old house, Italian. We have our same little waiter that we go to. We used to be able to walk there from our old house, but it's an amazing, they have this great outdoor patio, little chalkboard menu. It's just a great place. It's very homey, so I am looking forward to going back.
That's awesome. Sounds good.
Very. Look it up. And nobody paid me for that advertisement.
Awesome. What about your first car?
My first car was, so in Louisiana, you could get your full-fledged driver's license at 15. And
Whoa.
So, yeah, you could get your permit at 14. And so at 15, I know, right? At 15, I had a Pontiac Sunfire. I have no idea if they even make those anymore.
No, Pontiac doesn't even exist.
Oh, it doesn't?
No.
Like how much I pay attention.
So I'm pretty sure they don't make some.
So I should have kept it. It would be like an antique by now.
Yes. Might have been worth some money, finally, for once.
A Sunfire, yep. And then the Harley. So,
Very cool.
yeah.
That wraps up our second episode of our Whitley Penn Talks podcast, Major Fundcast. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your expertise. I learned a ton. Selena feels the same way.
Yeah, I think we're 3 Ps in a podcast now.
Oh, I love it.
Oh,
Thank you
very
guys
nice.
so much for having me. It was really fun and a pleasure.
Yeah. Everyone stay safe out there. Support your local donut shops. And we'll see you on the next episode.